There's no need to panic because Queenslanders have been doing the right thing.
At this stage, I do not think a lockdown is warranted. That could change.
4 new local cases in Queensland, 2 separate clusters, 2 mystery cases. The first, a fully vaccinated Brisbane man infectious in the community for 3 days. The second, an unvaxxed truck driver infectious for 8 days in shared accommodation.
Which Dr Young is a little bit more concerned about.
Vaccines now set to be mandatory for all truck drivers.
We've had 7 truck drivers who've entered Queensland who've been infectious in the community since the 24th of August.
Masks are back for Brisbane and Moreton Bay, including at the NRL Grand Final, where 50,000 fans are ready to descend this weekend. Townsville the backup plan if Brisbane is sent into lockdown.
We'll be updating the community every single day, very early stages at the moment.
As Queensland restrictions tighten, in Victoria, a slight easing tonight as the state hits its 80% single-dose target.
Our 10-kilometre limit for movement for those 4 hours a day goes to 15 kilometres. We're not overselling that. It's a modest set of changes.
But it comes as another grimmer milestone for Victoria is also reached.
We are reporting 867 newly locally acquired cases from yesterday, and in addition to that, a number of cases from the 2 previous days.
The state overtaking New South Wales in daily infections, claiming the unwanted top spot on the national COVID leaderboard.
Epidemiologist Professor Nancy Baxter joins us once more. Nancy, I'm just wondering if Queensland might have made a mistake by not going into a snap lockdown straight away. How worried should they be?
Well, I'm quite worried. There are actually 3 different cases that have been in the community. One is related to hotel quarantine and maybe a historic case, so may not currently be infectious. But the other 2 have definitely been in the community while infectious. So there's the case of the person that worked in the airline education industry and may have been in contact with pilots. And then there's the truck driver who may have brought it in as part of business. The truck driver particularly was at a number of shared accommodation, so lots of people there that could have been exposed and could have gone on to spread it further. So I think they're going to learn a lot of information over the next 24 hours. Hopefully they won't regret that they didn't go into lockdown sooner. But generally, we do need to know a little bit about how things have spread before you make a decision like that.
Nancy, I'm asking this question through the cracks of my fingers, but should the NRL go ahead when there are mystery cases in the state?
Well, I think you still have 5 days, and they do have an alternate. So I think that they can make that decision pretty quickly, although there'll be a number of disappointed fans because I know it's not as big a venue. I'd say over the next 48 hours, they're going to be making that decision. Either they're going to be lucky and there won't have been any transmission or minimum transmission to folks, or they'll be unlucky and there will have been transmission. And if there has been, then I think a lockdown, it's in the cards. And at minimum, they're not going to allow a stadium full of 50,000 screaming fans.
So, Nancy, in Victoria, that state hasn't reached its peak, but restrictions are easing. So are you worried about the numbers?
Yeah, I'm worried about the numbers. Probably the easing that they did a little while ago with the picnic kind of thing was more of a risk than the easing that they've done now. But anytime you allow any more mixing, it's always a risk of driving the epidemic further. I think what they're trying to do is get a balance between allowing people some freedom so that they don't just start having parties like we heard about recently in terms of the parties with the final. And so they want to kind of avoid those because that's going to drive the outbreak as well. So they're trying to have some kind of balance. Do they have the balance right? Honestly, I don't know. It's all very concerning.
What about the at-home testing that they're saying will now be available from early November? In what circumstances will they use those?
Yeah, so the at-home testing, it's everyone's probably very familiar with a pregnancy test. It basically uses the same technology. So, it's not the definitive answer. So everyone always gets a pregnancy test by their doctor after they've had at-home pregnancy test. And you still, for the COVID test, you still have to put the swab in your nose. So you have to do that right. But it allows you a very rapid answer in terms of whether or not you likely have COVID. It's not perfect, but within 30 minutes you can know. So I think what it's very useful for would be, if you think you've been exposed, to kind of check very quickly to see if you've converted, or say you're going to a wedding and you want to make doubly sure that there's no chance that you have COVID-19 to do a test before you go to a wedding or another event like that because you don't want to expose people. So I think that those are 2 pretty good uses for it. You have to kind of know what you're doing with the nasal swab and you can't avoid the nasal swab, but it does give you a rapid answer.
Are you worried, though, or is there a risk that people might rely on that instead of the full test when they shouldn't be? So I feel a bit sick, I use the rapid antigen test, I get a negative, I move on with my day.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully people won't test positive and then not act on that. And hopefully people, if they're feeling sick and have COVID symptoms, won't not get another test because they've been negative. Because you can have a negative test and actually have COVID. You're probably not infectious at that time, but tomorrow, if you're still having symptoms, you should probably get the PCR, the real deal test that has a better chance of detecting COVID if it's there. They're not going to replace the PCR testing. One of the great things that Australia has done in this epidemic is the testing. So we've had fantastic testing, really available. People have been using it broadly. So I think that this at-home testing is more useful in a place like the US that doesn't have that kind of access to the PCR tests, where it's very expensive, and so this is something that can be done cheaper. So I think it has a role in Australia, but probably not as big as a role as in places where they're just not getting testing right at all.
Hey, Nancy, when we open back up fully and everyone's, over 80% vaxxed, will people still go get tested if they've got a little sniffle? Is that how it'll work still? Or will the testing die down and everyone will just live with COVID more and you won't be doing that every time you're worried that you may have COVID?
Well, I think the challenge is when you're at 80%, it still means that there are 20% of people that haven't been vaccinated, and all the children as well. So there's lots of people that can still get COVID and can still get very sick from COVID because they're not protected. So until our vaccination rates are super high, like well past 80%, people still need to take their symptoms seriously and get tested, even if you've been vaccinated, because you've been vaccinated, so you're protected, but you could give it to somebody else who hasn't been vaccinated, and then they could get very sick and die. Or, people who are particularly vulnerable, like, older folks. We've seen a number of older people die even though they've been vaccinated. So, I think it's still going to be very important to test.
Nancy, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
You did the at-home test when you were in Italy, didn't you?
No, we didn't. They weren't there. We didn't have them then, but now everybody has them. All our friends there, all our friends in the UK have them. They buy like a 10-pack from the chemist and they just have them at home. It's in their arsenal of modern life now. And so if the kids are a bit sick and going to school, Nancy was very fixated on going to a wedding. But, if you are going to a social gathering,
would
have
you,
a quick test on the way
if you were having people over to your house, would you get them to do tests?
well, it depends who it was going to be, Waleed, and what sort of test.
And what sort of gathering?
Yes. I'd be more likely to get tests afterwards, I think.
You guys go to very different gatherings. With so much content online, it's sometimes hard to keep up with it all. And let's face it, who has the time? The Project YouTube has you covered with the stories that matter. Hit subscribe for a daily list of the news that you need to know.